science knowledge only adds to the excitement, the mystery, and the awe of a flower.
Evidence is evidence. It's public, everybody can look at the evidence and assess it, and eventually, if there's enough evidence, come to the same conclusion.
Cockatoos with attitude. Cockatude.
And that majority of birds who we see who are perhaps the most common feather picking, I think the prognosis is really good. We have close to a 90% success rate.
These are Chloe Sanctuary's beloved feather-picking birds. Simone was locked in her room with Cause for 12 years. Both she and Cause became feather destructive. The records show that Chloe had been chewing on herself since at least 1999. Her former caretakers took her to many vets and tried many things, but finally chose to have her neutered. Nothing worked. Coco had been chewing her feathers off about halfway down since she was a year old. Her caretakers had extensive records on the veterinarians they consulted. Peaches attacked her chest and the small feathers above her primaries. Because of her 6th fused vertebrae in her neck, that was all she could reach. Cause, Simone's friend and companion of 12 years, broke off her tail feathers and picked down her back. Roman worried his feathers into little bundles that looked like wet paper mache. Frustrated, his caretakers offered him to us for healing. Sugar had progressed to a full-body attack and chewed into her chest. During the time we were healing her, she almost died 3 times.
Feather destructive behavior or feather picking or self-mutilation problems is probably one of the most common syndromes or common problems that board-certified avian veterinarians see. In my practice, we'll probably see at least 1 or more new cases of those problems every day that we see patients. It's not uncommon for us to see several cases every day. They're problems that have plagued birds, especially since the early 90s, and I would say that that's a pivotal time in the disease problem because really the birds who were taken out of the wild and imported were not nearly as likely to have those problems. It's not that they never had them, but there was an explosion of self-mutilation and feather damaging behavior once the end of importation came. So most of these birds come in as young birds. They're not baby birds, but they're very often between 1 year and 2 years of age when they begin the behavior. They almost always have development of picking patterns. that goes along with the species. African greys, for example, start out picking a ring of feathers around their neck, and then it spreads down their chest. Macaws typically start picking their lower legs, as do some other birds. Eclectus pick their chest and their backs. Cockatiels pick and lovebirds pick the inside of their wings, their axilla, what's called their propatagium, the piece of skin that extends from their shoulder to their carpus. And it starts in those sorts of areas, but then once those feathers are, picked more and more, then the area that they pick spreads. And it's that little dose of epinephrine that he gets, that little dose of adrenaline that he gets when he hurts himself, that changes something about him and makes him feel better. What we see in these birds is that these birds aren't picking because their skin bothers them, by the way. They're picking because when they pull that feather, they get some positive reward from doing that. And so it's like any behavior. Behaviors are done because they give you a positive reward. And so you have to ask yourself a little bit like, what could possibly be positive by hurting yourself by pulling these feathers? And the answer is that when these birds pull feathers, they startle themselves, and they get a little dose of epinephrine as a result. So what we think happens with most of these birds is that the underlying disease that leads to their feather destructive behavior is already present, and they discover how to treat themselves on one day. So one day this African gray chick who's a year or 2 years old is grooming himself, and he's up here grooming these feathers around his neck where it's challenging for him to groom his feathers, and he accidentally pulls one too hard. When that happens, it's painful and it startles him, and his adrenal glands go off as a result. And it's that little dose of epinephrine that he gets, that little dose of adrenaline that he gets when he hurts himself, that changes something about him and makes him feel better. That's the reward. Why is that happening? Well, what we think is happening, and I think that I feel quite certain that this is the answer, but it's one of those things that's hard to prove, is that during the development in these birds, when we quit importing pet birds out of the wild, with the start of the CITES laws in January of 1990, we started breeding everything from in captivity. What we saw with hand raising birds is that there was some developmental step that was lost in those birds. So that shouldn't come as a big surprise to us, because there were articles published as early as the 1920s that if you hand-raised a number of different primate species, that you'd result in these animals who had obsessive compulsive behaviors, especially self-mutilation behaviors. We found out in the 1940s if you hand-raise puppies away from their parents, that you get all these obsessive compulsive behaviors. In their case, things like bed sucking or licking themselves and getting what are called acral-lick granulomas, where they lick their skin to the point where they get a lesion on their skin. We found out that cats who are hand-raised have obsessive compulsive behaviors, what we call blanket suckers or sweater suckers. We found out that horses who are hand-raised have obsessive compulsive behaviors, cribbing and weaving. So it should come as no real surprise that when you hand-raise a baby parrot, a very intelligent animal, that they might do the same thing. It's interesting because those things are illustrated in a number of other human things. We found out in the late 1960s that children who grew up in playpens developed dyslexia. And there may be other things that cause dyslexia. Not everybody who grew up in a playpen got dyslexia, but a very high percentage of children who grew up in playpens and walkers, starting as early as the late 1940s and into the mid-1960s, developed dyslexia. And that whole pandemic of dyslexia pretty much came to an end once they stopped letting people raise their children in a playpen. So you may notice if you go to Babies R Us today, you can't buy a playpen for your child. And even if you buy one of these little activity centers that you set your child in, there's a big sign on there not to leave them in there longer than a specific period of time. And the reason is that if you don't, is the act of crawling turns on the switch of something in your brain that makes that input of information and the way that it's handled different. And if it's not turned on, then you end up with dyslexia. And if it is turned on, you turn on more normal. And perhaps one of the most interesting things that that's happened recently, at least this was told to me, I haven't read the actual research, but I was told that in the early 2000s they discovered that that there's a developmental link to perfect pitch. And we used to think that people like Handel and Mozart, who had perfect pitch, and along with them being geniuses, turned out to be great, great composers, developed those behaviors just by a gift of God. They were just lucky enough to have perfect pitch. But we found out just recently, according to what I was told, that that everybody who grows up in a society where language is tonal, so countries like Vietnam or people who speak Mandarin Chinese, where the same word can mean totally different things depending on the tone that you say it in. I guess Mandarin has the 4 tones that you can say a word at, and that changes. That's part of the language and changes the, what a word actually means. That in those societies, everybody's got perfect pitch. So there's something about listening for pitch during a very specific time of development as an infant that turns on that characteristic of having perfect pitch. So people like Handel and Mozart, who had perfect pitch, both of who I understand had fathers who were musicians, professional musicians, must have been able to hear that, hear and listening for that tonality, and that turned on their trait for perfect pitch. So what we think happens in the case of birds and maybe some other animals who have these obsessive compulsive behaviors where they self-mutilate themselves is that they miss some critical developmental step when they're raised by a human and not raised by a pair of birds. And so not every bird who's hand-fed becomes an obsessive compulsive feather picker, and maybe not every obsessive compulsive feather picker was raised by hand, but the vast majority of feather pickers are hand-raised birds. The other thing there's other characteristics that maybe play a role, and one thing that we notice is that the birds who are the most, by species, who are the most prone to become self-mutilators or have feather destructive behavior are birds who are flocking species. So cockatoos and African greys and lovebirds and cockatiels, birds that are very likely in the wild to stay together in big social groups, are much more likely to end up doing these behaviors than birds like Amazon parrots and some of the larger macaws, poicephalus, like Senegal parrots and Myers and brownheads and redbellies. Those birds are highly unlikely to develop those behaviors. I don't think in my entire 30-year professional career I've ever seen a Pioneus parrot who is a feather picker. So there's something about those species that seems to protect them, and it's probably the fact that their social behavior is not nearly as complex as the ones who are very social flocking birds. So it's probably easier for those birds to miss that critical developmental step because they've got this highly developed, probably mostly instinctual social behavior that goes along with flocking. And if they miss that step, then that's what ends up leading to the problem that goes to feather destructive behavior.
If you are enjoying our videos, we hope that you can find it in your heart to support our work. It costs between $25,000 to $30,000 a year to care for our flock of heartbroken and abused birds. Most of our birds came with feather destructive disorder. Even a basic exam with blood work costs $300. Medical emergencies cost us thousands a year. We are a non-profit, and donations are tax-deductible to the full extent of the law. We need your support. Birds deserve a happy and healthy life. Become our patron at www.patreon.com/Chloe Sanctuary to support us on a per video basis, or donate at our webpage today.
The other thing that we see that supports that belief is that when we treat these birds, if we cover the most social times in their lives with the medication that stops them from feather picking, then we're the most successful. So if you take a bird and give it, say, Haloperidol, which we'll get to, morning and night, give it to him first thing when he gets up in the morning and last thing before he goes to bed, he's more prone to feather pick at the end of his day than a bird who gets his Haloperidol first thing in the morning and as soon as the owners get home from work, say. Because in the second case, we're covering the most social interactive times in that bird's day. He's getting the peak of his medication when mom and dad are and the kids are home and they're interacting and eating dinner and doing social behaviors. Then giving it to him, say, 12 hours later when he gets it and then he goes to bed. And he's missing, he's peaking with his medication after the social behavior. So we kind of have an idea of maybe what the impetus is, the hand rearing, and that they maybe miss this developmental step that has something to do with social behavior. But the next question is kind of, well, why do they do it? Well, what we think is happening to these birds is something very similar to what happens to people who have cutting behaviors or obsessive compulsive piercing or obsessive compulsive tattoo behavior, or even people who do things like obsessive compulsive shopping, because what those people will tell you they're looking for is this feeling they get when they do it. Most of those people have real high anxiety issues, so they're suffering from this anxiety disorder. But when they cut themselves and they get that big dose of epinephrine caused by hurting themselves, their anxiety goes away. And when they get in that new situation, their little brain says, this is it. This is what I've been worrying about all the time. And when that guy touches me, it'll be the end. So I once had a client who had started cutting herself as a late teenager, something like 17, 18 years of age. And she told me that even in her 50s, that if she feels anxious, the first thing she thinks about doing is cutting herself. Even though she hadn't cut herself for 40 years, that her brain had learned this trick. The trick is that if you cut yourself, you're going to feel better. You can make that anxiety go away and you can feel better. So when she feels that sensation of anxiety, her brain suggests the solution. And the solution her brain knows is if you hurt yourself, if you cut yourself, you're going to feel better. So despite the fact that she has medication that makes her feel better, she's got cognitive therapy or group therapy, she's got a psychiatrist, she's got a psychologist, she's done all these things for 40 years to help her not cut herself. Her answer is, if I feel badly, the first thing I think about doing is cutting myself. She also told me that some days I realize that I'm thinking about cutting myself and I haven't even really realized that I'm feeling anxious. So it kind of illustrates the power that these obsessive compulsive behaviors have over the individuals, whether it's a bird or it's a human, have. And so I think that, quite honestly, in most of these birds, it's anxiety. And the other thing that I think is a common observation from people who work with a lot of these birds is that if they're not medicated, these are anxious birds. If you put them in new situations, they're very fearful. They want to try and escape. They become aggressive because they constantly have that feeling that the shoe is going to drop. And when they get in that new situation, their little brain says, this is it. This is what I've been worried about all the time. And when that guy touches me, it'll be the end, and yet when you get them medicated, those anxiety type behaviors seem to disappear. So of course we're putting them on drugs that are aimed at anxious behavior and anxiety, but that seems to be the solution. diagnosis, well, I think there's a lot of stuff written and a lot of stuff in the literature about proving what these birds do not have. And I can tell you that in my practice, we don't get quite as caught up on those things, but we kind of know that, I guess there's things that could mimic feather destructive behavior. Infectious diseases like beak and feather disease or polyoma that causes damage to feathers, skin infections, some birds, especially lovebirds, by the way, get a herpes viral infection. They get it commonly underneath their wings, and every time they get stressed out, this lesion comes back, and it could be confused with self-mutilation behavior. But they're different in that the self-mutilation lesions usually aren't painful, where the herpes lesions are painful. So we want to rule out, at least make sure that the bird's healthy. So we'll typically be doing a typical blood chemistry profile on them, make sure their liver and kidneys and things like that are working, because liver disease could contribute to unhealthy skin and kidney disease could cause problems. We want to make sure they don't have signs of infection or inflammation, so we'll do a CBC on them, make sure their white blood cell count's not high. They don't have other things that would make us think they had something like that. If they have obvious lesions like a self-mutilation lesion, we might look to see if it's infected or they have some sort of weird parasite. But the vast majority of these birds don't have anything that's like that. It's interesting too that these birds will, some of the birds who truly self-mutilate will have some remarkable lesions, but when you palpate them and look at them and things, they're not painful to the bird. And if you watch the bird, it's interesting, they don't typically work the center of their lesion where the skin's missing and they're bleeding and have scabs. What they work is the margin of their lesion. And I think what's happened to those birds is that they've realized that, a lot of them are birds who started out feather picking, and now they have no feathers on the area that's kind of their target area of choice to pick feathers on. Rarely, so I think untreated, the prognosis for these birds is bad, because they will continue feather picking. I think their anxiety situation gets worse and worse because anxiety begets anxiety, and sooner or later most of these birds are destroyed. I envision them having one little feather there, and they're trying to get at that feather to pluck it to get that little dose of epinephrine, and they accidentally pinch their skin. But when they pinch the skin, that has a crazy reaction compared to just pulling the feather. I mean, it hurts a lot more and it gets a lot more of a result, and so they get a big dose of epinephrine. So then they suddenly become converts. Instead of just picking feathers, at least, they find that there's this huge advantage of pinching their skin. So even though they've got this big open lesion on their chest, most of those birds now want to, what they're doing mostly is pinching the skin on the side of the lesion, and so the lesion gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it gets deeper and deeper because they're doing that. So we want to rule out the obvious other differential diagnoses, but once we feel comfortable that the birds have obsessive compulsive behavior, then we go more after that, because there's a lot of people out there who kind of claim to be a bird trainer, bird behavioralist. Oftentimes their credentials is that they owned a bird once. What I might throw in here now is a little bit on just maintenance and behavior, and I will be the first to tell you that I think that there's things you can do behaviorally that will help these birds. You can make their world more dynamic and have more responsible social interactions with the bird, and give them occupation. What I called in a paper that I wrote once, compelling occupation, things that bird is compelled to spend its time doing. I think things like foraging toys and chew toys and a big outside environment that has fresh air and sunshine and lots of space, interaction with normal sorts of bird peers, all those things may help. But much like people who are cutters or self-mutilators, those things are alone or rarely, if ever, the answer. So I'm not saying that you should do them. I think that they should be done. I think that people who have birds like this should consult with a good, knowledgeable avian behavioralist, preferably one who's gone to college to understand those things and really knows what they're doing, because there's a lot of people out there who kind of claim to be a bird trainer, bird behavioralist, Oftentimes their credentials is that they owned a bird once. So those aren't the people who you're looking for. You're looking for people who have dedicated their careers to this sort of problem, if you can find them. And it's not impossible to have that relationship with that person long distance. So there's people who you can do phone or online consulting with who will oftentimes take care of you or get you in the right direction, even though they can't come to your home and see your bird and see the cage. Although I think those things are advantages if you can. So I don't want to discount those, but keep in mind also that I'm a veterinarian and I'm an avian veterinarian, and my job is to do the medical side of it. So what we'll address primarily is those things. If a bird's owner can just dedicate themselves to giving their Haldol to their bird and observing them, the majority of them do very well. I guess we ought to try to talk about treatment and prognosis. First of all, let's talk about prognosis. I think untreated, these birds continue this behavior. I think even with behavioral modification, they're probably likely to continue it. There's some exceptions. The exception is with monumental changes in these birds' lives, they commonly stop doing their behaviors for a period of time. And I can't tell you how often it is that I have a bird come and people tell me, I just adopted this bird, or I adopted this bird a few months ago, and he was in a horrid situation where he came from, and he had picked all his feathers out. And ever since he came to my house, he stopped picking his feathers. Well, that's a really common thing. The other thing we see is that if we have a bird who feather picks and we hospitalize him, move him into the hospital while we're getting him under control or something, those birds rarely will feather pick for a period of time. But once that bird becomes comfortable in its new condition and its new environment, they almost always go back to feather picking. Because just like that client of mine who spent 40 years under therapy, but still, she felt anxious. The first thing she thought about doing was cutting herself. These birds' brains will not forget about the fact that they have an answer to their anxiety, and the answer is pulling feathers or biting themselves and making a hole in themselves. So rarely, I think untreated, the prognosis for these birds is bad because they will continue feather picking. I think their anxiety situation gets worse and worse because anxiety begets anxiety. And sooner or later, most of these birds are destroyed because they can't live a normal, enjoyable, healthy life because their feather picking or self-mutilation is just out of control. I think treated, most of these birds have a good prognosis, and I would say in the old world species flocking birds like African greys, cockatoos, eclectus parrots, and that majority of birds who we see who are perhaps the most common feather picking, I think the prognosis is really good. I would say with Haldol alone, Haloperidol alone, we have close to a 90% success rate just with that drug. I think it's even better if they get some environmental and behavioral counseling as well, and people work on making those things better and better. But certainly I don't think that if a bird's owner can just dedicate themselves to giving their Haldol to their bird and observing them, the majority of them do very well. The ones who don't, we have some other tricks up our sleeve as well, by the way, and we have some other drugs that we get to. We'll talk about those, and we either use combinations with haloperidol or we use some of those drugs alone, and I think we probably pick up another 2 or 3% of the birds. And then of course there's probably a small number of birds who just have gotten to the point where we really are challenged to making them happy, and fixing their problems may be impossible in some small percentage of them. But I would say easily over 9 out of 10 of these birds, I think we can turn around and turn them into happy birds again. We're very successful in stopping them from picking at least while the drug is in their system.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
you get a set dose when you start, but you have to adjust it and titrate
Right.
it.
Yep.
And that's a big thing. People get the drug, they go home, they try it, it doesn't work, and they give it up.
Right.
So,
Yeah, so let's talk about the actual treatment itself. So what we do with the vast majority of these guys is we put them in haloperidol. The brand name of that drug for a long time was Haldol, although I think for the most part everyone uses the generic form of that drug today. It comes as a solution. It's 2 milligrams per ml. And it's water soluble, so you can be diluted just in water to so that we match the dose to the size of the bird and the ability of the owner to give it its dose. We learned a long time ago that if we start a bird out on a dose that makes it overly sedated, which is possible by giving it too much, that the owners very often bail out on the treatment and won't continue on. The other thing that we understand about the drug is that it's absorbed very rapidly out of the upper GI tract. So when you give your bird Haldol, it's absorbed into the bloodstream real rapidly, and you get a peak in the drug concentration, and then that gets redistributed to other tissues, and so the drug dose comes down. So when we dose these birds, what we're looking for is a dose that will make them look sleepy about 15-20 minutes after they get their dose. And they should be sleepy for maybe as much as 20-30 minutes, but by an hour after the time they get their drug, they should be pretty much back to looking like they're normal birds again. So what we usually try to do is we try and dilute the drug so that the starting dose is about 1/10 of a cc, regardless of whether it's a lovebird or it's a African gray or it's a Moluccan cockatoo. So once we have it diluted, we start at a conservative dose. So we're gonna shoot for something that's maybe on the lowish side of where we expect them to be, and we have people increase or decrease the dose as needed to get that behavior. So we're looking for that sleepy after about 15-20 minutes and not sleepy for, back to pretty much normal within an hour when they started. And typically, if it's diluted to that amount, regardless of the size of the bird, we can change it in 0.02 of a cc increments. So if you have the typical African gray who's getting 1/10 of a cc of the concentrate drug diluted 1-to-1, so it's half strength. Most of those guys start right at 1/10 of a cc. If you see no sleepiness, they're going to go to 0.12 for a couple of days. If they get no sleepiness after that, they're going to go to 0.14 for a couple of days. And if they get too big of a volume, we can always change the dilution on the drug so we get it back to a smaller volume to give the drug. If you've got the same thing, if you have a little peach-faced lovebird, say, who's self-mutilating, those birds, we're going to dilute their drug about 1-10, but they're still going to start out with 1/10 of a cc, and if they're not sleepy, they're going to go up 0.02 of a cc, or up to 0.12 cc's, or up to, if that still doesn't work, they're going to go up to 0.14 cc's. If we turn them into zombies, which we really try not to do, but if we give it to them and they're asleep in 15 minutes and they don't wake up for 2 or 3 hours, then we usually have people skip a dose or two and go down 0.02 of a cc. So they'll go to 0.08 cc's or 0.06 cc's. And then if it gets too low, it's just hard to know how much drug you've gotten into a bird. If you're giving him like less than 0.05 of a cc, we'll re-dilute it again so they get something closer to 1/10 of a cc that they're giving to them. So, but once they get that dose, we're very successful in stopping them from picking at least while the drug is in their system. In most species of parrots, we're getting between about 8 and 10 hours out of their Haldol. So if you're giving it to them in the morning, you can typically give it to them again about the time you get home from work, and they probably don't need it overnight because they're asleep. They're not being stimulated back into that state of anxiety. In the morning they get it again. By the way, people ask always, well, what about other drugs? What about, I've heard Prozac works on these birds, or I've heard Paxil works on these birds, or I've heard Valium works. Well, I think some of those drugs would work fine, and part of the problem with them is dosing. So I think there have been successes with Prozac, say, but the problem with Prozac is in the typical cockatoo or African gray, you have to give that drug at least 3 times a day. And in smaller species like a lovebird, you have to give it 4 times a day. So to try and medicate your lovebird every 6 hours or your Moluccan cockatoo every 8 hours becomes almost impossible. And if you don't maintain the drug level with those drugs, it doesn't work. So one of the great things about haloperidol is that you don't have to maintain a drug level for it to work. You just have to maintain it for the time that is the highest social contact for those birds. That's why it probably works so much better than those other birds. The Valium family of drugs also work, but they're even shorter lived, but they're sometimes great adjuncts, additions to the haldol in birds who have real problems. So macaws, I think I said, do this a little bit. Some of the, especially the mini macaws, and some of the larger species of macaws are feather pickers, and they do not respond to haldol quite as well as the old world birds do. Some of them do, and some of them do fine with just haldol alone, but the rest of them, what we typically do is we'll give them a little boost with a little Xanax, a little alprazolam during the peak time. So typically they'll get it also twice a day, and it's only probably lasting 4 to 6 hours, but that little boost of the alprazolam seems to smooth those guys out, and we'd probably fix most of those guys. They are a little more challenging, no question about it, than the old world birds. Now, prevention. How do we prevent it? Well, that's a big problem, because the paradigm of the bird industry right now is to sell hand-raised birds. So I honestly think the solution is to change that paradigm. But to get the bird industry to buy into letting parents raise birds again has 2 big problems. One is it's what the buyer expects. So part of the problem is that even if the bird breeder thought it was a good idea, he or she oftentimes can't find a market for their birds because they're not hand raised. The other side of it is financial, because if you let the parents raise their birds, they rarely will double clutch again. That's the end of their breeding for a year. So, but if you take those chicks away, especially with a lot of these species that we're talking about, African grays, cockatoos, macaws, those birds will go right back and lay another clutch. So you're getting 8 or 12 or 16 birds chicks out of a pair a year versus 4. So the economics are such that making a living as a bird breeder is a challenging thing anyway. But if you're cutting your profits down by 75%, you're getting paid for 4 chicks a year instead of 12 chicks a year, or maybe even 16 chicks a year. Makes it pretty hard to stay in business as a bird breeder. But therein lies the answer to the problem. It's just a matter of what can we do it. I think if you could find a breeder, if you decide that you want to buy one of these birds, you want to buy an African gray or you want to buy a cockatoo, if you could find the breeder who would leave a chick with a parent and have the parent raise chicks, I think your chances of getting a self-destructive bird is much, much less. But I don't know, it's just become, I talk about that with bird breeding groups and things like that, and it's not usually met with a lot of positive response. Birds who fly are much less likely to do self-destructive behaviors. Birds who have highly developed relationships with their owners are oftentimes less likely to do that. So the other advice I have with every new bird owner is to find a good bird behavioralist, bird trainer, and teach your bird good manners first. I think good manners for a bird consist of step up, step down, come to his name, stay when you tell him to stay, and poop on command. Those are just things that make your bird a lot more easy to live with, and if they do it, they can spend more time out of the cage. But once they've learned the come and stay commands, then you can start working on letting your bird free fly in your house or with your environment, because although I'm the first to say that there's nothing healthier and nothing more dangerous for a bird than to fly. The potential for calamity is great, but birds who get to fly are much more mentally and physically healthy than birds who can't fly. I mean, it's the foundation of being a bird. A bird's made to fly. But you really should have that control first. You need a bird who will stay when you tell him to stay and will come when you tell him to come. So if he gets outside the door and he's sitting up on top of that pine tree in your backyard, it sure is nice if you just whistle or call for him and he comes down to you. If he doesn't, you may never see him again. And if you have him out with you and you can put him down and tell him to stay and have some good hope that he's going to stay where you put him, then he's much less likely to fly as well. So, and I would also contend that teaching a bird to do those behaviors is no tougher than teaching your new dog to do good manners behavior. I mean, most people's dogs will stay when they tell them to stay, and they come when they call them. The dog's a little more compelled to come to you because that's part of being a dog. The bird's really has to think there's a reward at the end of that behavior, but I think you can teach most birds to do that. So I think that's part of the prevention. I think creating environments where the birds have to search for food and do foraging behavior, that have toys and other things that they're interactive with, have things like big cages outside where they can get fresh air, sunshine, make a big mess and not get into trouble, not destroy the kitchen cabinets or the furniture. All those things are good, but not everybody can put their bird outside in the backyard for noise reasons, because they live in an apartment complex or someplace where they can have their bird in the backyard. But those are things that should be goals if you can do it as a bird owner. The other thing that people will say is, well, birds just should be pets, and I don't know. I think that birds should be if birds are pets, they should be the pets of committed owners. But I know lots and lots. This is what I do every day. For 30 years I've been doing it. I see hundreds and hundreds of birds who are very happy pets. They love their owners, they're in good situations, and there aren't problems with them. But birds, to own a parrot, to own any animal who's that intelligent, whether it be a parrot or a primate, takes a much larger commitment than having something that doesn't need social interaction, that doesn't need to be mentally stimulated. And you can have goldfish and never come home except to feed them and clean their cage once a week, and your goldfish might be perfectly happy. You can't do that with a macaw. You can't do that with a Plucking cockatoo. They need that social interaction. They need that mental stimulation to be happy, healthy animals. So, but include them in your lives and supply them that environment, and it can be very rewarding both for the bird and for the owner. So I think that birds make good pets. It's just they're not the pet for everybody. And so what we need to change in our world is that level of personal responsibility, where both on the part of the potential new bird owner and the bird seller, whoever that might be, pet shop or bird store or bird breeder, to make sure that that person is committed to creating that environment. I think it's also important for bird owners to realize that they don't have to be their birds. I mean, birds don't have to have a single owner in their whole life. It'd be nice if they did, and if you're the perfect bird owner, I think that's really marvelous, because I think the birds, I think they have long memories, and they remember the people who have been in their lives oftentimes their whole life. I've met birds whose owners have had to go away and come back 10, 15 years later. The bird knows exactly who they are the moment they see them. But birds do accept new people in their lives. Not only that, but I'm pretty positive that if you're a parrot in the wild, your chances of spending your whole life with a single mate is probably pretty slim. Just because the way the world is, it's dangerous out there, and the wind blows and storms come and predators are out there, and your chances of being paired with a single mate their whole lives is challenging. So I think lots of bird species pair bond for life, but it's the life of their mate, not their lives. Or until they're separated. And some parrot species, that is not true at all. If you look at like eclectus, who have very strange social behaviors, the females are polygamous. They have multiple male mates. The males are monogamous. They're committed to their female mate as long as they can stick with her. So it's not all the same. It's not, one answer fits all parrots.
Positive? Oh, that was a Chloe. Chloe bird? Yeah, that was the Chloe bird. What are you doing? Yeah? Hello? Can I sneak the frisbee away from you? Can I just maybe go up here and try to sneak the frisbee? Nope. Not gonna fool you? Snowball. Hello. What you doing? What you doing? What you doing? Hello. 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 Hello, baby boy. You know, I've got another frisbee right here. You wanna go get it? I first learned about this protocol for treating feather destructive behavior when Chloe was, frankly, she was dying. She had lost all spirit to live. The area that she was tearing into was growing larger and larger, and she started sitting on the bottom of the cage. Normally when a cockatoo starts sitting on the bottom of the cage, you know that there's a serious problem. Quite possibly they're going to die. She was also losing weight. She had lost quite a bit of weight, and at least 10% of her body weight. So I took her to Dr. Jenkins, and he broadly smiled at me and said, "Don't worry. In a couple of weeks, this will all be behind you." Frankly, I didn't see how. He then began explaining to me in detail what happens chemically in the brain when a bird picks. And after he explained it, since I do have a background in biology and physiology, although not as deep as I would like, the lights sort of started to come on because she was so close to death. I was able to change. It's a tough one because most of us, and I know I felt this way, I didn't want her to be on drugs. But he was right. I put her on it, and it took a few days to find what level she was at. We set her at 0.11 when it started, and she ended up at like 0.14 before it took effect. And then eventually it lowered down, and it's changed over time. But that girl, she just lives a great life. She can't have babies because they gave her a salpingo-hysterectomy before she came to me. And so I let her go ahead and mate with Snowball, and they play in the back room, the sleeping room during the day. Just those two. They have their own little area, and they're both quite happy. The point was to balance that chemical activity in the brain so she could live a happy life, not anxiety to inflicting pain on herself to release, and then again, and then again, and then again, and all that just to try to maintain some kind of sanity. Many birds that have come into the sanctuary, there's 8 birds here that were all feather destructive. One was a severe mutilator, and they're all feathered now. And it's a job. You have to make sure that they're getting the right dose, and that they're not, if they're hormonal because we're in mating season, you may have to raise it up. And then if they're really relaxed and, life's easy on them, you may lower it down, but you have to keep an eye on it.
but I want to show you basically what we do every day. But basically what we have here is a bottle. It's like this bottle here. I've wrapped it in duct tape. And the reason I've wrapped it in duct tape is because it says right on the box, if you read the fine print, it's not that fine actually, but if it's not supposed to be exposed to light, it reacts to ultraviolet and it will reduce its effectiveness. So I keep it wrapped up, and the reason I don't use the bottle that they supply, what's in this box is this bottle. The reason I don't use this bottle is there's no way you can dispense it. So what happens is I take some of this and I shake it, even though it doesn't say you should. It doesn't say you have to. I shake it up. And what I do is take off the lid. And if you've got one bird, you're probably you can probably get a smaller amount than this from your vet, and you don't have to go through this process. But this is what we do. I put a little bit in the bottle. And the reason for that, why would you put just a tiny bit in the bottom of the bottle? And the reason I do that is if you happen to have the top off and the bottle falls over, you don't want to spill. You know, you don't want to waste anything. So wrapped to keep UV light from having an effect on it. Duct tape, or if you can find these bottles that are like this, where light doesn't get to them, then you don't have to do that. And these bottles, if you buy bottles like this, you'll get one like this from your veterinarian. If you're in San Diego, that would be Dr. Jenkins. But from whatever veterinarian, you will see that there is a little line at the very top of the bottle. There, it's kind of hard to see, but there's a line before it gets cut. And you just cut just above the line. And the reason you do that is so you can do this. You can put that in there and it forms a good seal. And then you can turn the bottle over and don't even have to hold the bottle. And then I look at the side, and this one's for Simone. So I put it at 0.13. Oh, now, there's a bubble in there. If you get a bubble, you just tap down below. And you get it to 0.13. These normally come, well, some of them come with caps. I made these using something that, it's a forming plastic. You just heat it in hot water and then it forms into, so you can form caps. So with each one, now if you look at this, this is a 1 milliliter or 1 cc syringe. I prefer the BD ones because they have a nice even flow. They don't come out too fast. If you get ones that stick a little bit and you go to squirt it in their beak, it can come splashing out, hit the back of their throat and come splashing out. So right now Lorelei's on 0.13. They call this a bolus. Now, how well we can see this, I'll probably take a picture so it's easier to see. But that's the syringe. And it's got gradations from 0.1 all the way up to 0.9. Because this is 1 milliliter or 1 cc. And then there's little lines in between. And those are tenths. So if I'm going to do Chloe, she's also at 0.13 right now. So there it is at 0.13. Now this goes pretty fast. I'm now doing Coco. She's been having a little issue, so she's at 0.14. Normally she's at 0.12. But when you find little coverts on the bottom of the cage in the morning, they're pulling off the little small feathers that cover the rest of the feathers, that's when you want to definitely raise up their dose by 0.01. Because if you don't, what's going to happen is they're eventually going to start working their other feathers. Hi, Coco. And here we go. Here we go. There you go, baby girls. Good girls. That's a good girl. And this is the bribery technique. Next we have the bribery technique, which is like this. Like this. Come here, sweetie. There you go. The bribery technique works very well. And then last but not least, the lighting on this one isn't too good, but and then it's just like that. And that's all there is to it. Simple.
So you want to know about me?
Yeah,
And my
definitely.
background. I grew up in the mountains outside of Salt Lake City. Not on a big ranch or something, but a big enough piece of property that we were pretty isolated and in an environment where houses were far apart. But I grew up around all sorts of animals. We had dogs and eventually cats in the house, but I got to raise animals, baby animals. We chased and caught lizards. We raised the baby birds who fell out of nests. We had a raven who adopted us and came back year after year after year every summer to live at our house and eat the dog food. I raised a deer who turned out, a fawn who turned out to be blind when he grew up. I don't know if that's why it got isolated from its parents or if it had something else going on. The fish and game agent who took it away when we discovered it was blind never reported back as to the cause. All sorts of other animals. So I had my first parakeets and guinea pigs that were my own when I was 5, 6, 7. I had rabbits by the time I was 7 or 8. I was breeding rabbits and guinea pigs by the time I was in my early teens, mostly to support my animal addiction. I was lucky in that I knew that I wanted to do this when I was little. When I was in 2nd grade, I repeat this story all the time, but when I was in 2nd grade and I got to go to the school's library for the very first time, I checked out Dr. Dolittle, and that was in the early 60s, and it was right after the book had come out. As a matter of fact, I remember it was on the new bookshelf, so long before the movie came out, just to age myself. But I took that book home and had my mother read it to me as a training manual, because I knew I wanted to do this, and I thought that Dr. Dolittle book would be a good way to kind of let me know what I needed to know to be an exotic animal veterinarian. I remember the first time I ever went to see a veterinary hospital, I was very disappointed because it wasn't anything like I thought it should be. My hospital's much more like I would have liked it to be when I saw that. So I went to high school and college. Lots of people told me you're not likely to get into vet school, but thank God I was able to. Went to the University of Utah, got my undergraduate degree in biology with a strong emphasis in comparative physiology. That's my passion. I love comparative physiology. Went to vet school at Colorado State University, and then I was blessed to get to do a kind of a training position with the 2 big gurus of exotic animal medicine on the West Coast. Walt Roscoff and Rick Werpel. Rick, bless his soul, is dead and gone, died of colon cancer, but Walt's still seeing patients in Hawthorne, California. But these guys are responsible for the vast majority of the drug doses we still use today in these animals, and I would say 90% of the blood values that we use when we test them. As far as CBC and chemistries. It was kind of funny because I think the academic community really gave him a hard time and criticized him over the stuff that they published on those normals. But I think they've been vindicated because today, 30 years later, we still use all their same values, so they were right. They just, same for both the antibiotic doses and a number of other drug doses, which they had to do kind of more through trial and error because they weren't doing blood levels and things like that. They were just doing what they could, flying by the seat of their pants and finding out what worked and keeping track of it, you know. So, but because I spent 3 years with Walt and Rick, I think I'm here where I am today, and I never would have been here had I not had that opportunity. So they're a big part of my my success of being a bird and exotic animal attorney. Moved to San Diego in 1985, opened this hospital in March of 1987. Moved in November of 85, so it took me a little while to get the thing up and running, and it's been going for 28 years as of the first of this month. Got to see a lot of things, but it's the animals that teach me stuff more than anything. And we've been wise enough, I'd like to say, to go look. So every animal that dies unexpectedly, I'm twisting somebody's arm to let me do the post-mortem on it to find out what it had, why it died, what was going on. And I don't resent doing any of those necropsies over 30 years. I've done lots and lots and lots of necropsies. I was lucky enough to get included in the political aspect of bird medicine and reptile medicine and small mammal medicine, and get to be part of that community and help direct the direction that some of that medicine went for years and years. I've been kind of out of the political end since the late 90s. Now my kids are grown up, I may get back in, so they'd better watch out. Because, I don't know, the other thing about being in this business is you get to develop an opinion, and I certainly have mine. So the caveat with everything is that, you know, this is my opinion. Some of it's proven, some of it's challenging, if not impossible to prove. At least where we are today. So thankfully, I'm still here. Hopefully I'll be here for a lot of years to go. I like going to work every day. Part of it's liking people, you know, because I meet people all the time who go, I want to be a veterinarian because I don't really like people that well. But my business is really a people business, because everything we do is negotiation. You know, we have to work out, because it's not like human medicine where we just get to do everything we want with your patient. Somebody has to pay for it, I'm afraid, and so everything we do, pretty much we sit down and try to figure out how to make it work. How do we do enough to save your animal at a price that you can afford, you know? So it's unfortunate, or fortunate, I don't know which, but it's the way veterinary medicine is.
We welcome your feedback on our videos. We look forward to your insights, tips, questions, stories, and pictures. You can email us at cockatude@chloesanctuary.org, reach us on Twitter @ChloeSanctuary, and join with us on our Facebook Chloe Sanctuary page. We hope you will consider supporting us on Patreon today. Patreon was created to enable fans to support and engage with the artists and creators that they love. Empowering a new generation of creators, Patreon is bringing patronage back to the 21st century. This is how it works. We produce up to 2 videos a month. As a patron, you pledge to give us a donation, whatever you feel is right and meets your budget. And Patreon gives us your gift monthly. You can easily set a limit on how much you donate a month. You can change the amount of your pledge at any time. Your gift will allow us to continue bringing you entertaining and informative videos. Some of our planned videos are Quality of Life, how using a quality of life assessment saved Sugar's life, how it can help your bird and offer you peace of mind. Home exams, how to do a home exam quickly, efficiently, and properly. Early detection saves lives. A new paradigm, what it means to be a parrot owner. An interview with Dr. Jeffrey Jenkins of the Avian and Exotic Animal Hospital. The adolescent bird, how not to turn your bird into a cruise missile. The real story behind the birds and the bees. Who is training whom? behavior training, and how to empower your bird to make good choices in our world. As a patron, you can also choose to be in the producer's circle, the director's circle, or the advisor's circle. Each donation level has benefits. The producer's circle helps to choose the next video we create and may help with scripting. The director's circle influences which birds are in a video and gets to choose how some of the sequences are shot. The advisor's circle makes suggestions for the directors and producers to consider. You can find out about these on our Patreon page at patreon.com/Chloe Sanctuary. We look forward to your participation in Cockatude.
Science knowledge only adds to the excitement, the mystery, and the awe of a flower.